Nido Queen is an underwhelming looking Pokemon. Its stats are below average, and its poison ground type combination leaves it vulnerable to a lot of common attacks. You may associate Nido Queen and her husband Nidoking with Gen 5 onwards, where they received a very significant buff in the form of the new ability Sheer Force. Sheer Force is one of the best offensive abilities in the game, increasing the damage of attacks that have secondary effects by 1.3 times, and removing the secondary effects. The majority of attacking moves in Pokemon have a secondary effect: Ice Beam with its freeze chance, Thunderbolt with its paralysis chance, etc. Trading that secondary effect for a straight up damage increase is an amazing deal that most offensive Pokemon would take if they had the option. Another advantage of Sheer Force is that for whatever reason, it makes you completely immune to the recoil damage from Life Orb. Life Orb just becomes a direct damage upgrade with no downside, which is incredible. This ability was enough to seriously enhance the viability of both Nido Queen and Nidoking. Nidoking is usually the superior choice because of its slightly higher offensive stats, which fits better with Sheer Force. But they are very similar Pokemon. It's hard to imagine these Pokemon having a viable spot in any metagame without the Sheer Force ability. But that's exactly what happened to Nido Queen in Gen 4 OU. Although Nido Queen is officially ranked in NU in Gen 4, players have discovered that it actually has a valuable niche role in the OU format. So much so that Nido Queen is actually officially ranked in the D tier on the viability rankings, above other OU ranked Pokemon like Mamoswine, Celebi, and Aerodactyl. Nidoking doesn't even appear on these rankings at all, even though it's usually the superior option of the duo. How could this be possible? How did this extremely average looking Pokemon achieve such a respectable rank and relevant spot in the Gen 4 metagame? Let's take a look. Like this video and subscribe so that we can help Iron Chugulus find a lawyer. Some have speculated that the recent Iron Mugulus vs Iron Chugulus boxing event, the most viewed live sports event in human history, may have been rigged. Thank you. Fighting types became a lot more powerful in Gen 4, with the introduction of a new move, Close Combat, which has a monstrous base power of 120, and the drawback of lowering both defensive stats. Fast offensive Pokemon really don't care that much about this drawback, and Close Combat is one of the strongest moves in the game, even to this day. Fighting types are very threatening to defensive teams in Gen 4 OU. Fighting resists are pretty hard to come by, and many of them have exploitable weaknesses. Flying types were once very effective against fighting types, but with the addition of Stealth Rock in Gen 4, flying types took a serious blow to their defensive longevity. There are some decent options in Gen 4 for Ghost and Psychic types, who are immune to or resist fighting type attacks. But both of these types are vulnerable to Pursuit Tyranitar, one of the most common and central Pokemon in the format. Handling fighting types can be a nightmare for defensive teams, with their massive breaking power and all of these potential answers to them being so exploitable. So, players got a bit creative, searching through the lower tiers for something new that might be able to help, and they discovered Nido Queen. Despite a terrible looking base stat total, that poison ground type combination is actually a great fit against a lot of common threats in Gen 4 OU. This is the fighting type answer that they were searching for. Unlike flying types, Nidoqueen has a rock resistance and is not very threatened by Stealth Rock. And unlike psychic or ghost types, Nidoqueen is not threatened by a super effective Pursuit. Not only does Nidoqueen resist fighting, it also has the ability Poison Touch, which has a 30% chance to inflict poison against any Pokemon that makes physical contact. This is a really great way to punish the otherwise spammable and dangerous Close Combat, and plenty of other contact moves too. U-turn is another very commonly used move that is very risk-free, a pivoting move that lets you respond to whatever the enemy does. Nidoqueen provides teams with an actual way to punish U-turn, which is a very rare quality in Gen 4. It resists bug and has that crucial poison chance anytime the enemy tries to make contact. Nidoqueen's rock resistance also comes in handy quite a lot against Tyranitar. Poison typing has another very useful advantage too. Gen 4 OU is probably the metagame where Toxic Spikes are at the peak of their relevance. Toxic Spikes are a solid strategy in this format that can be a great win condition and form of progress. Poison types actually remove Toxic Spikes from the field whenever they switch in, which in most generations makes Toxic Spikes inconsistent. But in Gen 4, the only OU ranked Pokemon that can remove Toxic Spikes is Roserade, which is why Toxic Spikes are quite effective in this generation. That hard form of counterplay to them is limited to only one Pokemon, unless of course you're using Nido Queen. Nido Queen not only shields you from fighting and rock type attacks, It shields you from toxic spikes, which can really tear apart defensive teams if they don't have a way to remove them. Nido Queen also learns toxic spikes itself, so along with all of that great defensive utility Nido Queen provides, it even has a way to apply pressure to the enemy and do something useful whenever it switches in. Nido Queen also has a vast offensive move pool with myriad coverage options it can use to fill gaps in your team. Earthquake and Earth Power are obvious choices for their stab damage, but other options include Ice Beam, Flamethrower, and Thunderbolt. Having coverage that can delete common Pokemon like Flygon, Scizor, or Gyarados is really nice, especially because many of these Pokemon will attempt to switch into Nido Queen and threaten it super effectively. Nido Queen can punish these aggressive switch-ins and totally ruin the enemy's plans. Nido Queen just so happens to solve a lot of problems that plague defensive teams in Gen 4 OU, and it actually provides a lot of value for a single Pokemon slot, which is surprising. Nido Queen is not a fundamentally powerful Pokemon. Its power level is quite low compared to everything else in terms of stats, but it has this specific combination of traits that allow it to fit perfectly into the Gen 4 OU metagame. When I was looking through SPL games, I actually found this one where the players Mail and Snowfall both brought a Nido Queen lead. This was really interesting, because both of their Nido Queens cancelled each other out in a way. Neither of them could create toxic spikes with their Nido Queen, because the other player's Nido Queen could always remove them. One of the ways Mail started to break through and make progress against Snowfall was by applying pressure to their Nido Queen and eventually eliminating it, so that they could set a layer of toxic spikes on the field without it being removed, and start applying more pressure to the enemy's Melodic and Celebi with the poison. Nido Queen was designed as the more defensively oriented choice compared to Nidoking, and Nidoking has been more relevant in most formats, especially after both of these Pokemon gained access to Sheer Force, and their identities completely shifted into a more offensive direction. But Gen 4 OU is a rare moment in Pokemon history, where not only is Nido Queen superior to Nidoking, it can actually function as it was originally intended, as a defensive utility Pokemon. Nido Queen was probably never designed as something that could compete with the top dogs, but here it is, defying the odds in Gen 4 OU, with a relevant role in this format that nothing else can fill. This is probably my favorite metagame development in Gen 4. This kind of thing tends to happen in older metagames, as things get more and more refined over the years. Weird Pokemon that seem terrible on the surface start to emerge to solve very specific problems. What do you think of Nido Queen in Gen 4? Who's your favorite niche option in an older metagame that rose in popularity years later? And what generation would you like me to cover next? Let me know down below in the comments, and thank you for watching. Thank you to the patrons for your continued support. Become a patron to appear on this outstanding end screen alongside your favorite Pokemon. Thank you as well to everyone who has donated to the prize pool for ADV Revival. We are already at over $2,400, which is fantastic. If you'd like to donate, the link is down below. Thank you.
Oh, KO by one hit! It scattered Spike!
The money got different.